Zero to Nothing Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Continuing our trend of examining abstract conceptualizations today, we're looking at particular phenomena which have the power to unite people, to instill religious fervor, and to organize and structure vast groups, all without being tangible or even fully explainable in some cases. Thought built around these phenomena is known as mysticism. So this is an interesting topic. I think that in the past we may have thought about doing this one because I was almost convinced we had done it.
Yeah, until I went back through our list, which I still got to share with you, and found, no, we've typed it, but I know we've talked around it.
Yeah. So yeah, we've sort of reached that point in the podcast where we've done so many episodes we really can't remember what we've done in the past. A lot of time has gone by. So what is mysticism?
You know, dictionary definitions are not terribly helpful on this, although etymology.
I almost like them for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
I almost like reading the dictionary definitions just to say, yeah, but that's really not it at all. Because there's powerful implications for that, right? If your dictionary definition is wrong, most of the time, if people hear a word that they don't know, or they want to know something about a word, that's the first place that they go. And the fact that they're so consistently wrong or
loose, because you're going to be loose about it anyway. But if, for instance, in one of the dictionaries, there's usually 1, 2, 3, 4 definitions. The second definition refers to self-delusion. Right off the bat, just I don't hold the editors responsible necessarily for trying to. I think they're trying to present a variety of viewpoints. But if that was the first time you hit the definition, then you'd already have the negative canting toward it. So one definition or approach to mysticism is that, bear with me on this. Mysticism is purportedly a meeting of, a union with, or an experience of something grandly other, a deity, a supranormal or supernatural being or state that supersedes the general roots of phenomenology. So what I mean by that is not through your eyes necessarily, not through your logic necessarily, not through your taste, but somehow you have these experiences of an awareness of, we talked about sublimity, an awareness of a sublime, or even an active interaction with something much larger than yourself.
That's awesome. I love it when I ask you the definitions at the beginning, because very often in just a sentence or two, you hit on all of the different stuff that I'm going to ask you about throughout the episode. So it's great. They're always a good preview or sort of insight into what we'll talk about. But yeah, and I think it's a really good description. And I think that a lot of people will know it intuitively. Because, if you think about it, in just linguistically, in sort of an abstract way, it doesn't really make much sense, right? It's this non-phenomenological thing. You can't see it or hear it or touch it or even really think, understand it with your intellect, but it's there. And that makes you say, wait, what? But then if you think about the word mystical, and anybody who has had a mystical experience, or if you ask them to imagine a mystical experience, somehow that phenomena is captured by the human experience. We've come across things where you go, well, based off my senses or based off of my logical or rational reasoning, this thing doesn't really fit. And I think then the question becomes, and it's going to be the main sort of topic of the show, is, well, does that mean that there's something out there, or does it mean that there are senses that I'm unaware of, or that my senses or rationality are integrating in a way that I can't understand, or how does it proceed from there?
And I like that you're approaching it with that step by step, because I think that's what it's about. I mean, if you take mysticism, another part of the definition would be more descriptive. That mysticism refers to a conglomerate or a cluster of any number of things, whether it's texts, esoteric writing, esoteric art, trances, visions, vision states. That it's a planetary phenomenon in the sense that it is practiced by religions, probably all religions, but not just religions, spiritual disciplines, which aren't necessarily religions. And so it has a universality that I think that's partly why philosophy has, and needs to explore it.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that it's a touchy topic because, like you just mentioned before we started the show, right? You ran into somebody in a coffee shop and they found out you're in a podcast and they said, "Oh, well, that's just BSing your way through a conversation in front of a microphone, right?" And I've had similar responses. I had a friend of mine once asked, when she found out I had a philosophy podcast, she said, "Oh, is that like, talking about astrology or conspiracy theories and stuff?" I said, "Well, no, but there is an aspect of it, right? Philosophy is looking at anything and then using rationality and insight and logic to talk about something."
Yeah.
And so, naturally over the course of a discussion, you're going to debunk things like astrology or, that sort of stuff. But the important part of philosophy is sometimes there will be things that you won't debunk, or you will debunk something that is been taken at face value previously.
Yeah.
And this isn't just a speculation. Like that's kind of the history of humankind. If you look at scientific advancements or advancements in human rights, or pick your category, any category, right? In every category of human experience, there's been philosophers who have said, just because we've been doing this thing the same way all the time, or we've had this same thought about something the same way all the time, doesn't make it right. Or, well, just because people believe that this thing is true or this thing has some power over their life doesn't necessarily mean that it actually exists. So,
and this is where philosophy, I think, bridges that very elegantly. You see, you read articles about philosophy and mysticism, and I've been steeping myself in those this week, precisely because one doesn't want to just. There's always an impromptu or a spontaneity in a good discussion, but you have to have enough of the material at hand to at least guide the discussion.
Yeah.
And philosophy bridges very well in talking about this because it often uses the word purported. So these things purportedly take place in the case of those who present them. And so the experiential experience of mysticism or a mystical state or any of the things falling in that category, if you say, well, purportedly this is what people say, you're establishing a bit of a distance and perhaps just a bit of a skepticism that allows you to still have an open mind, but to talk about it without endorsing.
Yeah, and that's important because, like you said, with your dictionary definition there, like the second one uses the word self-delusion, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the kind of language that really shuts down a discussion on something, and that's really not what philosophy is about. Philosophy is always about opening up discussions on things. That doesn't mean that you're going to endorse something or you're going to debunk something. Opening a discussion means that you're going to look at it as objectively as you possibly can through your lens.
And it doesn't mean that logic can't imply. And as we keep talking, I think this is as part of one branch of philosophy, because if mysticism is a mode of thought, or indeed any mode of thought that somehow involves spiritual transcendence, there's a mouthful of an idea, or spiritual illumination, and that goes beyond any ordinary, everyday, mundane experience, then you've got to have some way of arriving at it. And so Socratic method can work with it.
Yeah.
What makes this spiritual? What makes this,
Yeah. All right. So that's a good opening. So we'll dive into it a little bit.
Yep.
Are there different types of mysticism?
Yes. There are quite a few, actually. But we'll take some of maybe the more obvious. There is religious mysticism that's not only located in the Catholic Church, Christian, more broadly, traditions, goes back way back, but finds a great deal of expression in the 1300s, 1200s. There's Sufism in the Muslim tradition. There are aspects of Buddhism and Taoism, or in vision quests in indigenous cultures. So religion or religious mysticism of some kind, and then there's the spiritual, which not necessarily totally in concert with religious mysticism. And then within that, you have different kinds of things, such as whether an experience is, there are various words for it, but introverted or internal or external or extroverted. And the same kind of words we use to talk about so many different things, and you do in psychology, but does the experience seem to happen in an outward way, or does it happen in an inward way? And then there's monistic unionist, Latin is unio, which means that you are having a complete melding with something larger. And in religious terms, that would be with God. In spiritual terms, it might be with soul or the universe. Or the dualistic, which is, I'm having a conversation with these things. I'm meeting them, but I'm still myself. I haven't melted into them.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways you can experience this, right? There's, like you said, theistic, sort of religious mysticism, monistic, which is more personal in nature, and then panenhenic, which is sort of a catch-all for any of the ones that aren't those two.
Yeah.
And scholarly research on mysticism. This is something that has been looked at by scholars. You referred to the one, which was the sort of the inside versus the outside, constructivist versus I forget what the other one is. I think constructivist.
Sometimes it's called internalist, but
yeah. So, but some of them are more in favor or less in favor than other ones. But that gives us a good idea of the scope of the different types.
Right.
Does mysticism have a defined origin in history? Do we have like a spot where we can say this is kind of our first reference point to it, or is it something that's kind of always existed?
The word, interestingly, does. In the etymology of it, the word develops in the 1700s. But the concept is discussed back to Diogenes, who we've talked about before in ancient Greece. Diogenes might remember him being the person living in a barrel and and confronting people, but
the wild dog,
right? But Diogenes also asserting that everything in the universe is made of one thing, and so the mystic is someone, or the Greek version of the word is someone who modifies that in some way. But the most ancient version of the word is it in the Greek, which I can't pronounce. I won't try right now. It means I conceal, because there's always a secretiveness to mystic expression of ecstasies, religious ecstasies or spiritual ecstasies. And in the ancient world, there were things called mystery cults. Well, the mystery is based on the concealing and the coding and the separate languaging and the rites and rituals and those kinds of things. And that takes people probably to horror movies and back to conspiracy theories and all that kind of thing. But really, it's based in the ancient idea that if you are joining a mystery cult, because the word cult at that time did not have the accrued meaning that it has now. You were agreeing to expose yourself to ways of joining or meeting with that which is larger than.
Yeah, and that's going to be to me, that's the interesting part of the conversation that we'll get into a bit. Is this the very origin of the etymology, right? This concept of concealing, right?
Yep.
Because that's such a weird thing that has continued throughout the phylogenetic evolution of humanity, right? Is this idea that there's a secret knowledge, and that's really fascinating to me. Have any famous philosophers been mystics?
Well, some people would disagree with me about this, but I'm going to start in the middle. Saint Augustine. It has been by some argued that he was a mystic because of the ways in which he tried to discuss and lead people toward God, to think about God and to be close with God. There were many in the Middle Ages, Saint Teresa of Avila, many who expressed through music. She was a fascinating philosopher, but almost nobody in ordinary terms talks about her. Where that it's artistic renditions, either through music or through the visual arts, of what you see when you meet this other. But then, of course, there are some religions that say, no, you cannot in any way present that. This isn't to be made public. This isn't. So I think even the word secret and mystery, another root of mystic or mysticism, comes from, it means initiate or to induct. Well, we're all initiated into so-called secret knowledge. I'm just throwing the rock down to the other side of the stream that we're in today. Well, one could argue that many cultural things that become second nature to oneself and part of a culture, whether it's a little town culture or, going out from there, is not common knowledge to everyone. We learn how to behave in order to get along within that space. What we find out, we don't necessarily always share. And so there's kind of a mysticism in a strange, tight-knit community.
Yeah, and I think this is where it's important to sort of cast aside the preconceptions or the accrued meaning of the word that we have, because if you hear the word mystical or mysticism and you're automatically just taken out, whatever, then I think you're going to miss out on the conversation a bit, because it comes back to defining the component parts of what makes up a mystical experience, right? And I think this idea of secret knowledge is an important one, right? Because then you have to do the same thing in terms of the meaning of the word with secret, right? Mm-hmm. Well, what defines a secret? Is a secret something that is willingly withheld from somebody, or is it just knowledge that one is not aware of? Because in that case, being an initiate or, looking at concealed knowledge, I think that really plays an important part on the overarching conception of how a mystical experience is construed, and whether you fall into this theistic, monistic, or panenhenic sort of view towards it. Is there something that is keeping this knowledge concealed, or is keeping a secret, and that is going to initiate me? Or is it just knowledge out there that I'm unaware of, which we all have, that I've stumbled across, which has induced sublimity.
Yes. And this is why it connects with, for me, with what you were discussing with Kevin Palmieri a couple of weeks ago, that you can go unconsciously through the world. I think he used the word hyperconscious.
Yeah.
I found that an interesting term because the word hyper has so many implications, but I think that hyper consciousness might be another term for mysticism, because hyper consciousness would be hyper awareness or hyper attentiveness to things that you didn't even notice earlier. And for me, that's a more, if not comfortable, I think it's a more embracing way of approaching mysticism.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've always sort of liked the concept of mysticism. And I think that part of the reason is because I'm that kind of person who, I don't know, again, hyperconscious is an interesting term, but I'm just somebody who I do pay a lot more attention to things than I think a lot of other people do. One time at work, my boss found a dead dragonfly on the ground, and he went to throw it away. I said, "Don't throw that away." He said, "Why not?" I said, I want to look at that under the microscope. How often do you get a chance to look at this fully preserved thing? And I peeled away the different layers of its eyes so you can look at the different sections of the compound eye and different parts of the wing and things. And you start to see the sort of universe of things at this level that you never get the chance to see, because a dragonfly is always in motion. It's always faster than you. It's always blurry. It's always just out there somewhere.
And while you were in, so this is brilliant. This is wonderful, because I think mysticism must be talked about through examples that people wouldn't necessarily think. I mean, not for nothing did I wear one of my Doctor Strange Master of the Mystic Arts shirts today, right? Because that's how people often look at it. Oh, swirly colors, or wiggling your fingers and doing things, and that's fun. But and I'm not mocking the rituals and the disciplines of various. We'll get to that. But when you were examining that dragonfly, I would guess that for those moments, the rest of the world didn't exist.
Yeah,
you were looking at something that we don't normally see, can't normally see without necessarily the enhancement of technology. But first, you paid attention, you wanted to look at it. Second, you looked at it very closely, and you were studying it. And study is always part of mysticism. Study, the discipline of scholarly attentiveness and focus can lead you into an altered space. And you don't have to drop pills to it or take mushrooms or anything else, which some people do, the peyote buttons. And I'm not mocking those things. I'm just saying that altered consciousness or altered state of being does not mean going through things like you see in movies in order to achieve them.
Yeah. It's really, it's hard to kind of explain, but yeah, I think study is important. And I think that having an open mind is halfway to getting there, right? If you don't have an open mind, then you're not going to ever be open to studying something. And having an open mind and studying will necessarily lead you to study things that may turn out to be unworthy of your study, or may lead to results that are different from what you think. Like, I'm also somebody, right, who, if I every once in a while, if I see something on Netflix, right, where this is obviously a conspiracy theory documentary, I'll still watch it. Not very often. Most of the time, I'm more geared towards things that I know have some value. But every once in a while, I think, well, you know what, this seems intriguing, so I'm going to watch it, right? And I'm going to, you try to keep an open mind, and then you try to look at the evidence presented, and then you look at the way it's presented, or the evidence that's given versus what's excluded, and then the conclusions that are drawn, right? And you eventually get to a spot where you've come to a conclusion about something. But again, I think that's part of the mystical experience, right? Is having an open mind to study something, but also taking a chance, right? Because if I'm going to watch a science documentary, right, about, let's say, climate change,
mm-hmm.
I'm probably unlikely to have a mystical experience with that because I know the general precepts surrounding the premise of the documentary, right? I might be looking to deepen a body of knowledge. But in terms of encountering something that's unknown, or having some sort of experience of studying something that is outside of this, that has what we talked about in the beginning, that phenomenological, it exceeds the phenomenological,
yes.
right?
Yes.
It may be unlikely to experience it. So yeah, how you get into the mind frame of experiencing these things is sort of interesting, which leads to the question: is mysticism necessarily religious in nature? And so we talked about the different types, and we said, okay, well, there's a theistic type, and then there's these other types.
Yeah.
But when you get down to it and examining this experience, we've done an episode on religion.
Yeah.
Is mysticism religious in nature at its core, do you think?
Well, initially it was back to the mystery cults, but one of the reasons that the word mysticism became a formal coinage in the 1700s during the rational age, science is launching and so on, is to reflect an ecumenical, which is broadly speaking, if you refer to ecumenism, it's finding a commonality across religious barriers. So you're not adhering to religious specificities. There's that, but then it takes one more step beyond that. So it's really reduced to a Joel. It's the relationship between subject and object. I really think that's how it can best be understood. So I'm going to go back to your dragonfly. There's nothing inherently religious necessarily in your contemplation on that dragonfly. Now, it's possible within yourself that you might have found it a spiritual experience, whatever we mean by spiritual. We can define those as we go, but or you might have thought of the totality of creation, or of the incredible nature of evolution, or any of those things. But that object, that being, now just a physical shell, led you into a space of intense curiosity, if nothing else. And that might have consciously or unconsciously led you into larger spaces, and thus an encounter with the universe itself. And that can certainly be religious, but I think once we get from the 1700s and moving forward, especially into our own time, I think that to say it's religious is to limit it too much. It doesn't need to be theistic in order to be mystic.
Yeah. I think I agree with you. I think where it gets interesting is, right, we've talked about how if you click the first article in a Wikipedia page, you have a 95% chance to get to the philosophy article, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of the same thing with a lot of sources of inquiry, where we say, okay, well, mysticism, in many ways, it's a type of curiosity that's looking at knowledge which transcends the phenomenological. But I think that sort of line of reasoning, if you start clicking those links, right, curiosity beyond phenomenological, and you start going back, it takes you back right to the beginning of the universe, whether it's through religious means, right? Like, oh, well, did did a being design this dragonfly, or whether it's evolutionary, right? Was there some sort of
pressure of
was there some mutations or some pressure or something? You start going back, well, how did this thing develop out of something else? How did life come from something that was non-living? How did matter come in the universe? And it comes back to these metaphysical questions. And I think with the metaphysical questions, when you get back, there is a lot of, you either come down to being religious, or I guess I should say or religious or philosophical, right? Because religion is necessarily a philosophy, but yeah, I think but there's still the distinction, right? You could probably still follow a whole line of reasoning without it being a religious experience.
The very title of our podcast expresses the essence of one branch of mysticism. And this is where the philosophers argue that mysticism goes way past Christianity or religion itself at a point. And did even in the 5th century. There was a philosopher named, well, we call him Pseudo-Dionysus the Areopagite. Now that just sounds like it's out of a fantasy novel, yeah. but if you look him up, it's fascinating. And there was an author of a tract at roughly the same time called The Cloud of Unknowing. Well, it wasn't at the same time; it was in the 14th century. And the mystical spirits experience one branch of it that is considered not religious, goes back to that, where it is a perception of nothingness, from nowhere to nothing, and even in again, going to Buddhism, some practices or Taoism, there is an essence of getting to a state of nothingness, which some construe as a state of being totally integrated with, I love this word, the ineffable, which itself is a very argumentatively based word in philosophy. But if you're totally integrated, then you are nothing but the whole. So I think that when you're contemplating the dragonfly, for instance, or when this is one doesn't perform one's experiences unless you're formally doing a script or something on stage. And that's not what I'm doing now. But when I'm painting, I'm involved in a painting right now that is deeply important to me, and when it is a portrait, and as I'm painting this portrait, I find myself taken out of myself or shrunk to the quantum realm of myself. I'm not sure which, or both, in which the smallest detail of light on skin becomes a geometric form that altogether works to take the place of a face. But you're going down into these elements, and at the same time thinking about the person that you are rendering, so to speak, and knowing that you're never capturing that person, but you're capturing the impression of an essence of a moment. There's something almost mystical in that creative experience for me that transcends anything I ever felt when I was formally experiencing a religion.
Yeah, and this is touching on a lot of things that we've talked about. When you talked about Buddhism and being integrated into the whole, it reminds me of our conversation about harmony last week. This idea of and talking about, well, are component pieces necessary? Are separate pieces necessary? Or is it all just sort of an aspect of the whole? And I go back to Sabine Hassenfelder's book and our discussion over the past several weeks about reductionist science And even in articles that I just read this morning about how they're going to have to retool the first law of thermodynamics, retooling a law, right? And so this idea, one of the sections that stood out to me in existential physics, right, talking about worlds within worlds and how could the universe be a being that could think? She said, well, technically it's not ruled out. It would be very slow thinking, but it's possible. But she said, no, if you shrink down to the quantum realm, you couldn't have a universe in an atom, because when you get that small, things cease to function. And it makes you wonder, we were joking about it before the show. We both watched Ant-Man Quantumania last weekend, talking about, well, how are they even breathing down here? They're smaller than the air molecules would be. But this idea that, again, science doesn't know everything. And some of the very basic foundational concrete aspects of science are being rethought in our time based on technological innovations, which have shed new light on things that we previously took for granted, which is part of what I just talked about at the beginning about why it's important to examine every concept, right? Whether it's something that might be as silly or self-delusional, according to the dictionary, as mysticism, all the way to something that is as concrete or taken for granted as the first law of thermodynamics. Looking at something philosophically and taking the information that's at hand and rationally examining what we know is always an important step for thinking about these things.
Yes.
And and I think that nothingness is a great one. If we haven't done that one, we probably should, because that concept, I think anybody who's seriously tried to meditate has probably run into this problem, right? Empty your mind, right? Think about nothing. See how long you can do that for, or if you can even accomplish it for any split second.
And this is why some traditions, even of yoga, of my teacher, and this is like, it's not even 7 degrees of separation with some of the most influential teachers in the 20th century, the 21st century, that it's not about emptying your mind. And this is where the rationality comes in. It is about imagining yourself, putting yourself in a space where everything that comes tumbling out of your mind, you say, you, sit there, I'll get to you. You, over here, you come first. So you're contemplating things, but that you are in charge of the order of the dining table.
And so, right, mystically, that's interesting, right? Because what we had talked about before, these other mystical philosophies, talking about absolute nothing and trying to separate mysticism from religious feelings. I think that idea of nothingness becomes very important, right? Because if something is not a religious experience and you get back to the metaphysical questions, then I feel like there has to be a nothing at some point, right? Before the Big Bang, there's multiverses, right? Or whatever. And you get all the way back to this origin point. You say, okay, well, maybe there was vibrating strings or, membranes or something that caused it. But where did these things come from, right? This idea of nothing at all. We have to do an episode on it. But I think that it's
I agree.
Very important. What is the difference between mysticism and esotericism?
I would suggest, just myself, the main difference is that esotericism concentrates on obscure, rare, arcane, archaic knowledge, traditions, texts, information, but it can be a study for its own sake. Oh, this is an interesting book. A little sideways as a talk as an example. I'm an H.P. Lovecraft scholar, published a number of things, not huge, but I've been interested my whole life. guided by people in the field who are huge. S.T. Joshi being one of them, and the main one, really. But you can study Lovecraft's writing as a literary thing, but Lovecraft has an esotericism running through some of the work in which he refers vaguely. It's the vagary that's really interesting, to suggest that language cannot encompass what's out beyond us. But he invents things too. One of them is a book called the Necronomicon, which became subsumed into video games and Dungeons and Dragons and everything else, I think. So, and it's this book of the ultimate esoteric book of knowledge that you're not supposed to have. But it was a story tool, a literary device, a creation in the story. And I encountered people at conferences, usually young people, and I had to be very gentle because one young man came up to me and said, "Where can I find a copy of the Necronomicon?" after I'd done a presentation. And I said, "In the stories of H.P. Lovecraft." No, I mean the real thing, because we know there's a real thing, and it may well have had people's skins as covers. I said, no, this was an artistic creation. All the rest of that is flim-flammery that itself has become its own artistic, capitalistic great creation. To anyone's knowledge, there is not a Necronomicon. But so the esoteric wants to be able to touch the book. The mysticist, the mystic, wants the knowledge that might be within.
Yeah, I think the important distinction here is a phenomenology, right? The phenomenological experience. I think that esotericism is obsessed with the phenomenological experience, the ability to tangibly obtain this knowledge.
Touch,
right, yes.
Yeah.
So there's secret knowledge, and I can tangibly obtain it through reading a book or through, a piece of art. I think that, Lovecraft is the perfect example, because there's mysticism in Lovecraft with that stuff. When you're reading and he says things like a name that can't be spoken, which is sort of Jewish Kabbalah sort of mysticism, or
Cthulhu.
Right. These beyond is disgusting or hateful beyond language or these sorts of things. That's mysticism. But the Necronomicon, which is probably loosely based on like the Egyptian Book of the Dead or something like that, is more esoteric because although in the literary sense it's fake, right? But in that universe, right, it's probably an esoteric text. So I think that is a good distinction, is the phenomenological experience of the concealed knowledge separates mysticism from esotericism.
And back to at least as far as Aristotle and before, there is a whole branch called rational mysticism. Aristotle said that the soul seeks to be united with the ultimate, which is mind, intellect. The Greek, or the word is, I've heard it pronounced a couple of ways. It's spelled Nous, but nous, not like the nous. And so the mind seeks ways to rationally find its way. And that's what you were doing with the dragonfly.
Yeah, and so this leads me to a question. I'm really interested to see what your response will be to it, because I think that it highlights this amorphous nature of mysticism. Is mysticism the antithesis of agnosticism?
Yes. You have, ever since I first encountered you, asked those interesting questions. Is it the antithesis of agnosticism?
Yeah.
All right, I need to ask a question in return before I need a little clarification.
Okay.
So by agnosticism, are we agreeing that we're referring to an approach to the universe that says, I'm not sure there's a God?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sort of an ambivalence about metaphysical questions or answers.
Yeah, okay. I don't think it would be exactly an antithesis, uh, because an agnostic is open to possible metaphysical experience. That because an agnostic is open to the possibility that there may well be something larger than us, but it quite probably is not the limitations of a being that is often presented in sacred text.
Hmm.
So an ambivalence is, yes, it's an ambivalent version, but it's not the same as it's not the opposite of something like rational mysticism. Because an agnostic can still seek to know about the universe, or now a rational mystic would still ultimately assert that the mind, the capital M mind that we're looking for, is a divine mind, because we only have this sort of this limited vocabulary about how we refer to things: God, gods, the supernatural being, a deist, a deity, whatever. So a divine mind, even if it's just what we might now call a thinking universe. And we go back to Sabine Hausenfelder's position on that. So I don't think it's opposite.
Yeah, for me, it's a difficult question because,
it is.
Mysticism is sort of built around this idea of, concealment, right? There's concealed knowledge, there's secret knowledge, and a mystic is initiated into this secret knowledge, this hidden knowledge. So it's this idea that, okay, there's this thing that people don't have access to that I have access to. And agnosticism is almost the opposite of that. It's almost saying, well, you know what? I have access to the same information everybody else has, and you can't draw any conclusions of really about what's out there. So, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think that where we can, I think clarifying is too strong of a word, right? But I think that where we can start to pick at the issues with the categorization that our language puts into these terms, right, is by going back to some of our philosophical pillars, right? And I think that the two are most relevant here are ontology and epistemology, right? I think that ontologically, an agnostic can be a mystic, because the experience of being, right? If you are an agnostic, right? If you don't have those preconceived notions or those religious beliefs about the universe, then I think that opens up your ability to be curious, your ability to have some of these experiences that are enlightening or that are beyond phenomena that cause you to have what we would term a mystical experience. But I think epistemologically, I think that probably mysticism and agnosticism are mutually exclusive, if not antithetical, because the knowledge of a mystic is predicated on the fact that there's some secret or concealed thing that they're initiated into, whereas the knowledge of an agnostic is predicated on the fact they can never know, right?
Okay.
And so I think that it might be issues with just the terms themselves. Maybe the terms themselves are not accurate to define the concepts that we're trying to attribute to them.
I think so. And I do like the way you're working your way through that. So now I'm going to pour more mud into it. And I've been contemplating this because it's been part of, I think, my awareness of things as a teacher for most of the time that I was formally teaching, which is to say that it is mystical, but not in the way that Doctor Strange and all the movies and all the cults and all this. No. And this is where people like, I'll say something that this is where people like certain governors who say that education is about indoctrination. They don't have a clue what they're talking about. They don't understand what mysticism is. They don't understand what education is. I'm going to put that aside, but it goes to the same thing. When you go to a university or college, whether it's online, it's live, wherever it is, you are inviting yourself into, and have been invited as a standing invitation, capitalistically. But more importantly than that, getting past that, you are invited into a conversation. You're invited into becoming aware of knowledge that's available that nobody wants. And that's an esotericism in itself. The secret doesn't have to be a secret. It's kind of a reverse secret. People want it to be a secret, and they want to call people in education elitists because they don't want to know that that knowledge is there, and they tell themselves that it's not. And then they go on living their lives the same way and keeping doing the damage to people that gets done. The mysticism in education is opening your eyes to the knowledge that exists, that is as close as a book, a conversation, and thereby growing out of, beyond, deeper, all of those terms of who you were because of how it affects your identity because of the knowledge that you are taking in. And that is not an indoctrination, because an indoctrination says you all must believe the same thing. That's nonsense. That doesn't happen in education. People like DeSantis who do that, they don't have a clue what they're talking about. Presumably he was a teacher at one point. He wasn't a good one. And I can say that because it's mind. It is individuality. It is how do you grow from what you've learned, and what will you do with that? That's mystic in the sense that you're becoming more one with the entire world around you. I'm not asserting that as a Greek mystery cult, but to me, it's a metaphor for that.
Yeah, no, that's a super fascinating take on it, because you're absolutely right. When you think about the esoteric or some of those other things, like a spell book, right?
Yeah.
So it's supposed to be this secret knowledge that nobody has, that everybody wants. But you're right. There's no such thing as spells or magic. So the book is really what it is, right? Education is just like that. And I think that you can sort of see this demonstrated by, and again, it's never this clear in real life, right? There aren't two camps. Everybody's on a spectrum. But for illustrative purposes, right? If I tell people I'm getting a PhD in psychology, right? You have a couple different responses generally. One of them is people having a mystical view of your capabilities. I've had people ask me medical questions. I've had, people ask me questions about all different types of things because they assume that if I have a PhD, I knew something about everything. When in fact, a PhD in psychology that I know once told me that having a PhD is just knowing more and more about one thing until you know everything about nothing, right? And that everybody who gets into psychology is just in it to fix their own problems, right? And so he's a funny guy, and he was, tongue in cheek and things. But he's right. A PhD, necessarily, if you strip everything else away, it really is just being an expert on one thing. However, I think a byproduct of somebody who is that curious in one thing is that person, you generally don't find people who are that curious about one thing, or they're a bit odd. Most people who are that curious are just people who love learning, who love knowledge. And so they do have a wide knowledge base. And so lay people who have this mystical view of PhDs have probably encountered PhDs who seem to know something about everything, right? On the other end, you have people who view people who have PhDs as the guy in the coffee shop, right? Who was talking about our philosophy podcast, right? Or these sorts of things. People who think, okay, well, these are just people that went to school and you know what? They learned a bunch of complicated words that nobody else can understand and don't really have any meaning, or have the same meaning as simplistic words, but they choose to use big ones just to try to conflate their own intelligence with people. And so, really, they're just frauds. They're just shams, right? And I think that those two viewpoints are directly correlated to people's experiences with education. And I think that you can use that as sort of a crossover into mysticism and into esotericism a little bit. I think people's reactions to those words are going to be similar in what has people's prior experience been with the concepts of mysticism or agnosticism or education?
And most of those experiences are about what other people have told them.
Yeah.
Before they ever have the experience.
Mm.
Or the judgmental things that are said about it. What's a doctorate? Is a symbolic, formally granted degree indicating that you have the most intensive mastery of a subject that is available at that moment in that sub-branch of that subject that you've been studying. But no one who takes education seriously stops at the doctorate and says, that's it, I have nothing else to learn.
Right.
Because this is where Taoism or Buddhism comes in. This is the Zen cone. This is when you've mastered something, you realize that you know almost nothing, and you must keep learning, and you must keep trying, and that is a life's work.
Yeah, because if you look at a field of knowledge, right, the field of knowledge isn't growing at its core, at its roots, at its center. It's growing at the edges, right? And so that core and the roots, that's the stuff that you're learning.
That's the foundation.
That's the stuff you're learning in middle school, in high school, in your associates, in your bachelor degree. When you get your master's and your doctorate, you're starting to learn things at the edge of the field. And the edge of the field is what's growing the fastest. So as soon as you finish your doctorate, some of the things that you've learned are already outdated, and there's new things that you don't know that are coming into view. So yeah, it's really, it's very momentary.
You are the James Webb Telescope.
Yeah.
When you've achieved a certain degree of your education, which is to say, following what you just said, you're looking at the edge of the universe, and dang, it keeps changing because we keep finding things. And that causes us to rethink the law of thermodynamics. Mm-hmm. And if you were ideologically trained, you would accept blindly something that somebody told you must say at all times in order to be a good citizen. If that's not what mysticism is about, it's not what education is about.
So, is mystical experience a manifestation of sublimity, do you think?
That would imply that sublimity is actively involved. That sublimity manifests this thing as if to stretch out a 10, 15, 20-fingered hand and say, here, this is the way to me. I think
this gets back to our initial question at the beginning of the episode, right? Is this idea of, well, is our extra phenomenal mystical experience actually caused by something else, or is it an integration of our phenomena that we don't understand?
Well, right? That's the internal and the external, isn't it? Go back to the dragonfly. Do you look, thinking about that experience, were you consciously moved by something saying to you, what are you doing with that? Did you feel that, or did you just say what?
No. Right. So I think that, like you said, there's just this, you start looking at it and you start realizing that this tiny organic machine, right, is much more complicated than you thought, and that you have no idea how it got to being what it is.
But back right to the first moment when the guy's sweeping it and picking it up, what was your first response?
Yeah, I just immediately stopped him and wanted the dragonfly, I think because there was a novelty to it, right? I'd never found a dead dragonfly.
Would you say that was internal or external?
Yeah, that's the interesting question, right? And this goes into developmental psychology, right? It's that idea. Was there a stimulus of seeing? Is there a stimulus of seeing a novel thing which caused the response of wanting to investigate it, or was there some pre-existing cognitive structure that identified this thing as being something that was important to my development?
There's a confluence of both.
Yeah.
All right. And if so, Did the sublime give you a push? Who am I to say no? But it's kind of circular, because whether the sublime gave you a push or your innate curiosity gave you the push, ultimately you ended up at a moment of sublimity.
And I think that that's the issue with sublimity and mysticism, is that an important part of the definitions of them is that they're extra phenomenal, right? You don't know where they come from or how you interact.
But you can talk about how you interact with them. You can speculate on where they come from. That doesn't necessarily lead you to anything. But the rational or ethical. Does that come from a bad place? Am I going to do something wrong? Do I really want to do something vile with this? Or is it just, it's dead, I want to look at it? There's ethics involved in that. There's aesthetics involved in that. Thus, there's philosophy involved in that. And where it comes from is speculation. But why or how you interact with it, there's some speculation on that too. But the fact of the interaction and what you do with it, that you can break down very rationally.
Yeah. So is mystical experience perceptual or interpretive?
Yes. So when you say perceptual, are you saying, is it phenomenological? Is it located in our senses?
So I ran across an interesting thing doing the research for the episode,
Yes.
which is that most of the scholarly work on mysticism has rejected the idea that it is interpretive and has accepted the notion that it's purely perceptual.
Yes.
So in other words, as you're coming across,
That's true.
when you have a mystical experience, it's really just sort of the overwhelming of your senses rather than a future reflection on what occurred.
I disagree with the current, respectfully, because I don't have the degrees
Right.
to formally engage, but I have the right to formally engage as a person who practices philosophy. And I disagree because of the aforementioned artistic experience. You look at a piece of paper. It's a fascinating piece of paper, just as paper. Now, somebody will listen to this and say, he's a madman. Yeah, I'm staring at a piece of paper that's all crumpled, thinking it's a piece of packing paper out of a box. Wouldn't that make a fascinating locus for a painting? And then you start looking at the contours. And you start finding the values of light. And then something says to you, how would a portrait work on a piece of paper like this? Now, the moment I say how would, I'm engaging in some kind of pre-thinking about interpretation. Whereas when I'm just staring at the paper because it's fascinating to stare at, that's perceptual.
Yeah. And so, here's where it gets real interesting, is because defining where the mystical experience starts and ends. I think that we can agree that it's in the perceptual. Definitely in the perceptual. That's part of it. But our descriptions of mysticism up to this point have said that it's extra phenomenal, even to the extent that it goes beyond the intellect. And I think that maybe what the scholars are getting at is that when you get to the interpretive portion, right, after, you may not even be over the perceptual mysticism, but I think they're thinking once your intellect kicks in and you start trying to rationalize the experience, that's when the mystical experience ends. And I don't think that I agree with it either, because this is going to, and again, I'll be a madman with you, right? Because this happened to me yesterday. I opened up my cupboard and there's a box of Triscuits. And on the side of the box, it says 3 steps. 1, cook the wheat. 2, weave the wheat. 3, enjoy a golden brown snack. And I said, wait, we skipped a whole lot. I said, if you've ever looked at a Triscuit, how do you weave those individual fibers together, right? And I thought about that for probably 10, 15 minutes. I haven't looked up if there is a how it's made video yet.
You will.
but if you look at a Triscuit and you see these tiny little wheat fibers, and you go, those are woven together. How do they do that in an automated process in a way that is financially feasible and is, efficient in a manufacturing context. How is it done? Right. So, it's one of those things where, to me, in that case, maybe there wasn't even a perceptual, I didn't need to see a Trisket, but the interpretive part, all of a sudden, my intellect and my sort of, my ideas of my perceptual experience were overwhelmed, right? Where I said, oh my gosh, like who thought this up? Who designed it? Who developed it? How is it done? It's, it's going back to, Asimov and saying, or Clark and saying, any technology which is sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic, right? Like, well, this is advanced enough for my simple brain that it's magic. A Trisket is magic to me. I don't understand
that. Now, not to put a damper on it, because you're madman right there with me. And I won't accuse Triscuits of this, the manufacturer of Triscuits, because I don't know that about them yet. But this morning, my knowledge of the world was extended in a way that I'm saddened by, because knowledge is not always a happy thing, gainful thing. The number of children, primarily immigrant children, who are here without their parents, close to a couple 100,000. Many of them are working at night as child labor in, well, for instance, packing Cheerios. Once every 10 seconds, a girl who's 12 years old has to take a plastic bag of Cheerios and put them in a box. Avoid the cutting machine that's doing the stuff and grab the thing and put it in. Now, the process is still magic to make those Cheerios, but the esoteric knowledge that ordinary people wouldn't want you to have because it's too ugly and grim is that's at the peril of kids who get hurt, who are getting paid next to nothing in the 21st century in the United States in order to make, not the Trisket, the Cheerio. The reason I bring that up is just piggyback on what you're saying. There is a mysticism in realizations of things, and knowledge can overwhelm. And it is the other mystery in knowledge is why such things would take place, and that can move one to want to make changes. So there's power in it. Knowledge is power, but it's a mystical kind of power that can become a social kind of power.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think and that goes back to what we were saying with education, right? With this idea of the PhD, right? Is this monolithic sort of title, when in reality it's a fleeting thing practically, right? In practical sense, it's a fleeting. I think you mentioned on a show a while back that you knew somebody with a PhD. They got a PhD 25 years ago and they didn't do anything with it, but they still like to act like an authority on something as if the state of knowledge remains static, right?
Right.
And I think that's...
They didn't learn their Jedi lesson.
And that's an important part of the mystical experience. It is this encounter with something that's unknown. And I think that the perceptual part of it kicks in right away. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting take, that the scholars didn't view mystical experience as being interpretive. And that's the only conclusion that I can come to, is that their line of reasoning for that is saying that once you attempt to make, once you bring your intellect into it, once you begin to rationalize it, the mystical part of it disappears. But when I think about things like dreams that I've had, right? Obviously, the experience of a strange dream is mystical. But even after waking up and trying to put the pieces together, for sometimes years trying to put the pieces of the dream together to make sense out of it, it's still mystical, right? I think that
or can be. Not every dream, but some dreams.
Yeah.
Jaguar dreams or other parts of a house dreams, and you keep going back to them and you think, there are all kinds of psychological things probably going on and experiential things going on, but there's still an attempt to go further with the mystery.
Yeah. So, oh man, this is a fun one.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep pondering.